After tomatoes, now onions are on the onion prices, so to speak, are on the boil, Kartik, and the government has wasted no time. The moment there was a spike, the government has stepped in, taken a series of measures. But the fact of the matter is that one of those measures hasn't gone down well with the onion farmers in the country.
Absolutely, Krishna. So I think the government was very clear in trying to ensure that it's able to ebb the rising onion prices, which was selling at about 30 rupees a kg. The government, 35 rupees a kg. The government wanted to hem it down to 25 rupees a kg. As a result of that, what the government initiated was telling the farmers that there is going to be a 40% duty on export of onions. So, not making it lucrative for farmers to sell their produce outside of the borders of India and making it totally non-lucrative for them to earn any revenue by way of exports and keeping all their produce only for the domestic market. Now, as a result of that, the farmers and the farmer producer organizations are up in arms against the government, stating very clearly that they are not going to auction their produce of onions in the open market. Now, I think all this is stemming out of desperation from the end of the government to try and tame inflation, food inflation particularly, which affects every citizen and in an election year, every voter. So, it's at that juncture where good economics is being replaced by bad economics perhaps, for good politics, but I think we need an economist to answer that even better.
Oh, we do need one economist, and we do have one. In fact, joining us live, Kartik, we have Mr. Karan Bhasin joining us live on the broadcast here. Karan, thank you so much. As always, a pleasure having you here on News 9 Live on Business Plus. Talk to us from potatoes. Now the focus is on onions. Thankfully, onion prices haven't become 100, 120, 4 times, 5 times. It went up by 10 rupees, and there's been a strong intervention from the government side.
Right. So, the issue over here that we have is, at its very core, we have had a very different pattern of rainfall this year. And whenever you have, unseasonal rains and so on and so forth, onion prices too tend to kind of pick up in certain parts of the country. It happened, I think, 2 years back as well. So it's not surprising that onion prices are being pushed up because, of course, it's at the end of the day, it's all about demand and supply. What is particularly important to stress here is that had we, not gone back on the farm laws, had we not, reversed the changes to the Essential Commodities Act, etc., probably farmers could have benefited from the new laws, which would have restricted government's ability to intervene in markets and would have also, enabled a more robust and efficient supply chain to come in which case both consumers and producers would have benefited. But the fact that we didn't allow that to happen means that essentially we have a situation where when prices go up, there would be political pressure that the government would face, given that most of the countries are net buyer of food products, and they will have to intervene in order to keep prices low. And that's essentially what they're doing, because the problem with food inflation is that when we talk about inflation, a key component of it is also expectations. And in India's case, if you look at the expectation survey, and I've done quite a bit of work on this over the last 2 years, hopefully some of it should be out in public domain soon. A lot of the food inflation feeds into expectations, and that kind of makes higher inflation expectations entrenched into the system. And once that happens, even RBI is kind of in a situation where it needs to tighten more and more, thereby increasing the cost of existing installments. EMIs would have to adjust, tenures will have to adjust, and so on and so forth. So that contracts household balance sheets. So I guess there's not much option or not much policy levers that are available with the government, since it is likely that onion prices would be volatile going forward. And I think the decisions that have been taken keeping it in mind that there is political pressure, and then there's also economic consequences of not doing enough at this moment to arrest prices from going up before expectations become well entrenched into the system.
Hi Karan, nice to connect with you after a very long time. I just wanted to pick your brains on on some issues that I've been trying to battle with in my head. Number one being that, of course, you mentioned farm laws, and farm laws for whatever reason did not go through, and there was enough and more protest against farm laws. which sort of got the government to take a step back. But even in a bad monsoon, if government would have been perhaps the only buyer, even at a higher MSP, farmers would not have really been able to sell outside of what the government paid them, or the pressure of low supply in any case would have got the government also to shell out perhaps more money to procure those farm products. But anyway, let's keep farm laws aside for now. I want to understand tactically in the arsenal of the government or the decision makers, policy makers, what are the tools available to actually hem in inflation? RBI, I believe, cannot do much at this juncture, because by way of any further tightening, only the demand side could get hemmed in. But on the supply side, which is the crux of the problem on food inflation right now, which is headline inflation, the RBI has got practically very little influence on how to foster supply. And on the fiscal front, aren't these export restrictions and upping the duty on any export or vegetable practices going to in some way maybe help tame inflation at the cost of economic growth? We are also talking about our exports getting cut because of these government pressures.
Right. So, it's a very different and challenging global economic environment that we are in, because you're right. The RBI essentially has just interest rates as one of the policy levers that they have, and that is not going to be enough to tame food inflation. And a lot of this is because of unseasonal rain and, bad monsoon and so on and so forth. But at its core, essentially it's the government which will have to step in, because they still have more fiscal policy levers available with them. The challenge, though, is that if they were to use, say, a tool like MSP, for every 10 percentage point increase in MSP, of weighted average kind of basket of the agricultural produce in it, you end up having a 2.2 percentage point increase in CPI. So over there also, they're more and more constrained, because if you do increase MSP, you're expanding your fiscal, or you're relocating money from one area to another, and at the same time your interest cost is going to go up, because if inflation picks up, interest rates would go up, and that would further squeeze
Correct.
fiscal space available with the government.
So
So
what is
more
the
than
tool
anything
available
else, I
right
think.
now with the government, Karan? What is it that the government can practically do to tame inflation at this juncture without compromising on growth prospects?
Well, I mean, essentially, you want to keep prices in check, but at the same time, you also want to ensure that you have enough supplies to begin with. And the only way to do that would actually be to allow imports to begin with. And that would, of course, create downward pressure on prices. And you're right, growth would, at least export growth would suffer as a consequence of this. But the challenge really is that if you don't do that, the counterfactual would actually be much worse. So you're really in a situation where there's not much choice available than to restrict exports, and at the same time, hopefully at some point, open up imports of these particular commodities where you see variable pricing.
But
I
Karan,
do, however, expect.
wouldn't that run into a challenge of its own? Because the moment we go to the world asking them to export vegetables to us, they would counter us by saying that, hey, why don't you open your rice exports and your sugar exports back to the world? And that again becomes another challenge, because we want to keep on holding on to our reserves of rice and sugar, again to tame the same inflation. And then if you're forced to export them as a reciprocal of the rest of the world exporting vegetables to us, we run into the same catch-22 situation.
Right, but there's a difference here. When India did restrict our exports, it was done not just with the objective of price stabilization domestically, but also with the objective of using it as a strategic or a geostrategic policy lever, because we are still giving rice shipments and sugar shipments to countries, but we're doing it through our diplomatic route, and through government to government kind of agreements, rather than allowing market forces to operate. And I think the objective there is more geopolitical in nature rather than economic. At least my sense is that it has been done, given a lot of developments that are happening in BRICS and so on and so forth. So those are the objectives with which those restrictions have come in. I do feel that the supply constraint is not going to be as severe as uh, people are worried about, but it is still important to be worried about and be ahead of the curve, because otherwise you end up in a situation where, as you did with tomato prices, which went up substantially, and now they're gradually coming back to a more reasonable level. They're still not back to where they should be, but at least they're coming back to a reasonable level. And
Right.
I suspect something similar could have happened even with onion in the absence of proactive interventions to begin with. Now, I, for one, believe that you don't need any of these interventions because essentially you are interfering in the market mechanism of price discovery. But unfortunately, the way we are at the moment, there's not much choice available. And
Do
let
you
me
think
add
the
one more
leadership
quick
in the
point here.
country would have agreed with you on this point, Karan, had it not been a run up to the elections? Do you think the government would have not made these interventions had it not been elections next year?
Well, I don't know if they would have still made. I strongly suspect that the political economy of India is such that even if there weren't general elections next year, these decisions would be taken. And I suspect that's probably because you do have state elections happening every year and
Yeah,
every 6 months.
yeah.
So we are a country which is perennially in an election cycle, like it or not.
So, as
And
an
that, of course,
economist, Karan, as an economist, what is your one line advice to the government? Wait and watch, let the Rabi growing season come in, let El Nino fears subside, or let El Nino hit and go back, and do nothing right now? Is that the best way to let market dynamics play out? Or is there some real fiscal stroke monetary intervention that the country should do at this stage?
well, I mean, they do have the price stabilization fund which is available with them. And I would have first preferred to use that rather than banning exports to begin with. That would have been the first policy lever that I would have. But I strongly suspect that the efficiency of that fund has been really poor and they haven't been able to figure out how to best utilize it. If it were up to me, I would have advised not to get panicky and kind of bring in these restrictions at this point. But then again, at the end of the day, I don't have to deal with monetary fiscal coordination or the political economy of India. So as I said, that a lot of these choices are made keeping in mind not just economics but also the political economy and the reality of India, where inflation itself plays a significant role in shaping up of expectations, food inflation in particular. So,
All
if the
right.
objective is to end the monetary tightening cycle soon, and alleviate more fiscal space, say within the next 6 to 8 months or 1.5 year, if that is the objective, then I think it makes complete sense to kind of arrest onion prices to go up, because onion prices, when they go up, they have a disproportionate effect on inflation expectations. And as we know that the MPC and the RBI do look at inflation expectation, which feeds into their forecasting models as well.
All
So
right. Talking about inflation, I just wanted to ask, how right do you think is the Prime Minister in saying that, inflation is essentially an imported phenomenon given, the global supply chain disruptions as a whole?
well, I mean, across the world, it has been an imported phenomena. And the question really is then, if it is an imported phenomena, then who is the country which actually exported it? And the answer to that question is something that we all know, and uh, right now, what looks very likely is that rather than importing inflation going forward further, China might end up exporting deflation. And that's a real concern with which people have to be vigilant about dumping activities that might happen as their economy slows down. But I do think that my views on inflation cycle has changed a bit, because I expect a lot more of supply chains shifting, which seems to be happening underway. And that process and that disruption itself will be a process in which price adjustment would take a bit longer. And what that really means is that for the next couple of years, we might not go back to the persistently low inflation regime that we have experienced in the last 30 years globally, and in India probably the last
But Karan,
8 years or so
specifically, food
pre-COVID.
inflation is what we are grappling with. See, I understand it's easy to blame Russia or to blame the world when it comes to rising crude prices or overall supply chain constraints. But here in India, what is really biting us is food inflation. And this food inflation coming out of a bad monsoon and the overall disruption in the domestic supply chain. Is it really fair to say that this inflation mess is actually a function of global import?
No, so if you're talking about just food inflation, that is different than inflation overall, because food
Right.
inflation, as you would know, at least during the first 2 years of the pandemic, was still muted in India. There were occasionally some spikes that happened, and those spikes happened because of mismanagement of supply chain domestically.
Right.
But a key component is also fuel prices, because it feeds into transportation. And if you look at
Of course.
domestic fuel prices, there is still scope there. I mean, I think 6 months back there was more space available with the government to bring them down. I think now that space has shrunk a bit, but there is still space available with the government should it want to kind of bring down some of these logistics costs that might indirectly feed into vegetable prices. So there are all sorts of choices that are on the table, essentially, but we must accept that the reason why fruits and vegetable prices or pulses prices have gone up in India have to do with the bad monsoon that we have experienced, and we also should come to terms with the reality that such kind of weather shocks, adverse weather shocks, might become more and more prominent going further, as we have been witnessing over the last couple of years throughout the world. And that's essentially the reason why there's so much talk on moving towards a more sustainable agricultural policy to begin with. So I don't know what more can be done, because irrigation is an area where, of course, a lot can be done, but even that would not
Monsoon-proof
alleviate these
agriculture is
pressures.
what Karan
Yeah.
is talking about. We've got to make our agriculture monsoon-proof. We've got to make it sustainable, and we've got to try and make sure that going forward, we are not faced with a situation which is completely out of our control, even though it is monsoon-related.
Like the one we do
Right.
face at this point in time. So, but Karan, thank you so much for taking time out to speak to us here on Business Plus here on Newsnight. Lovely having you back. Hope to keep having you again and again in the future as well. But for now, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for being with us.